Look at this photograph from 1896. An elderly grandmother with her twin grandchildren, two boys, approximately 5 years old. All three dressed in formal Victorian clothing. The grandmother seated with dignity, her hands resting on the boys positioned on either side of her. A beautiful image of three generations united. It's sweet. It's touching. It's a portrait of family continuity and grandmotherly love. But when photo restoration specialists enhanced this 128-year-old photograph in 2024, examining details lost to nearly 13 decades of deterioration, they discovered something that transformed this happy family portrait into something heartbreaking. Subscribe. Because one of these twin boys was already dead when this photograph was taken, and the restoration revealed which one, and why this grandmother was raising her orphaned grandsons alone. The photograph arrived at the Victorian Memorial Photography Archive in London in February 2024 as part of the Whitmore family estate donation, a collection of late 19th century photographs documenting a prominent Yorkshire merchant family. The image showed three subjects in a formal Victorian studio setting, carefully arranged in a classic, multi-generational family portrait composition. The photograph was taken in a professional photographer's studio, evident from the formal painted backdrop and controlled lighting characteristic of the 1890s. At the center of the composition sat an elderly woman, appearing to be in her late 60s or early 70s. She occupied a formal Victorian chair, a high-backed upholstered chair typical of studio portrait furniture. Her seated position created the compositional anchor for the portrait, with the children positioned on either side of her. The grandmother wore full Victorian mourning dress, all black, as was proper for Victorian widows or women who had experienced family loss. Her dress was elaborate despite the somber color. Black silk or wool with intricate detailing, high neckline trimmed with black lace, long sleeves with decorative cuffs, the fitted bodice and full skirt characteristic of 1890s women's fashion. Her white hair was styled in the elaborate updo typical of elderly Victorian ladies, pulled back from her face and arranged in a formal bun with decorative combs or pins. A mourning brooch, likely containing a lock of deceased family members' hair, a common Victorian memorial practice, was visible at her collar. Her face showed the composed, dignified expression expected of Victorian matriarchs. Her features suggested strength and resilience despite advancing age. Her hands rested on the shoulders or heads of the two boys positioned beside her, a gesture of both affection and control, keeping the active children still during the long photographic exposure. On either side of the grandmother stood twin boys, appearing to be approximately 5 years old. They were identical or nearly identical in appearance, emphasizing their twin nature. The boy on the grandmother's right, viewer's left, had light-colored hair, neatly combed and parted. He wore a formal Victorian child's suit, dark jacket, knickers, white shirt, with large decorative collar, typical of boys' clothing in the 1890s. The suit appeared expensive and well-tailored, indicating the family's prosperity. He stood close to his grandmother, positioned slightly in front of her chair. His expression was solemn and composed, as required by Victorian photography conventions. The boy on the grandmother's left, viewer's right, had matching light-colored hair styled identically to his twin. He wore a matching Victorian suit, the same dark color, the same style, the same white collar, emphasizing the boy's twin status and the family's wealth that could afford matching outfits. He stood in a mirrored position to his brother, on the opposite side of their grandmother, creating perfect compositional symmetry. His expression also appeared solemn and composed, facing the camera with the blank, controlled look that Victorian children were taught to maintain for photographs. His posture mirrored his twins, upright, still, formal. The symmetry of the composition was striking. The the grandmother centered in her chair, one twin on each side positioned identically, both boys in matching suits with matching hairstyles, creating perfect balance. The grandmother's hands on both boys emphasized her role as their caregiver and the family connection binding all three together. The photograph itself showed catastrophic deterioration, typical of 128-year-old images. Extreme fading had reduced much of the image to sepia and brown tones, with enormous detail lost. Extensive damage, massive cracking, heavy foxing, severe water stains, edge deterioration, compromised large portions of the photograph, obscuring many details. Everything about the visible composition suggested a formal but loving multi-generational portrait. A grandmother with her twin grandsons, all dressed in their finest clothing, all positioned close together, creating an image of family unity, generational continuity, and grandmotherly devotion. The matching positioning and clothing of the twins emphasized their special bond. The grandmother's protective hand placement showed affection and care. Nothing about the clearly visible elements suggested anything tragic or sad. It appeared to be exactly what Victorian family portraits were meant to be. A formal documentation of family, preserving the image of a grandmother with her beloved twin grandsons for future generations. The photograph arrived with a notation on the back reading, Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore, with grandsons Henry and Edward, Yorkshire, September 1896. Dr. Caroline Fletcher, curator of Victorian memorial photography at the archive, made her initial assessment. Formal family portrait, Yorkshire Studio, September 1896. Elderly grandmother with twin grandsons approximately age 5. Typical Victorian composition and styling. Extreme deterioration requires comprehensive restoration. Beautiful example of multi-generational Victorian family photography. But Dr. Fletcher had no idea that when the restoration revealed details hidden by 128 years of fading and damage, this beautiful example would reveal itself as something else entirely. A memorial photograph showing a grandmother with one living grandson and one deceased grandson, both twins dressed identically, creating one final image of the family complete, even though one child was already gone, and the grandmother was raising the survivor alone after her daughter's death had left both boys orphaned. Dr. James Morrison, specialist in Victorian photograph restoration, began comprehensive digital restoration using advanced techniques specifically designed to recover information from catastrophically deteriorated 19th century memorial photographs. The process began with ultra-high-resolution infrared and ultraviolet scanning at 4,800 dpi. These specialized wavelengths could penetrate through layers of 128 years of degradation, revealing information invisible to normal light and invisible in the badly faded original photograph. The photograph was a gelatin silver print on albumin-coated paper, standard for 1896. Over 128 years, the organic albumin had degraded catastrophically, causing the extreme brown-yellow discoloration and massive cracking throughout the image. As Dr. Morrison processed the multispectral scans, something unexpected emerged in the analysis of the two boys. The infrared imaging revealed significant differences between the twin on the left and the twin on the right that weren't apparent in the degraded visible light photograph. He applied sophisticated tonal reconstruction algorithms to recover contrast and detail from areas where fading was most severe. As the enhancement processed the boys' figures, differences became increasingly apparent. The boy on the right, viewer's right, on the grandmother's left side, showed normal photographic characteristics, natural variations in density and texture consistent with photographing living tissue through fabric. The boy on the left, viewer's left, on the grandmother's right side, showed distinctly different characteristics, His figure displayed unusual uniformity in infrared imaging, a pattern Dr. Morrison had encountered many times in confirmed Victorian memorial photographs of deceased children. He then examined both boys' faces under extreme magnification. Victorian photography's long exposure times, 30 to 50 seconds, meant living subjects would show minimal but detectable micro-movements, tiny shifts in facial muscles, imperceptible eye movements, slight changes in expression during exposure. Under maximum magnification of digitally enhanced faces, the boy on the right showed subtle indicators, consistent with a living child captured during long exposure, barely detectable asymmetries from muscle microtension, natural variations in how light reflected from living eyes, slight inconsistencies in gaze direction. The boy on the left showed something different. When enhanced to maximum detail, his face displayed perfect stillness and geometric precision, qualities suggesting manual arrangement by an undertaker rather than natural positioning during exposure. Most tellingly, his eyes showed the distinctive corneal opacity pattern that appeared in deceased subjects, a subtle cloudiness that infrared enhancement could detect even when invisible in the deteriorated original. Dr. Morrison examined the boy's hands and positioning. Both boys appeared to stand beside their grandmother, but enhancement revealed crucial differences. The boy on the right showed natural weight distribution in his stance, subtle shifting, natural balance, the living quality of a child trying to stand very still, but unable to achieve perfect stillness. The boy on the left showed perfect geometric positioning, absolutely still, weight distribution suggesting external support rather than natural standing. When Dr. Morrison examined the area behind this boy under infrared, extremely faint structural elements became visible, shadows consistent with a concealed posing stand, the specialized Victorian equipment used to support deceased subjects in natural-appearing standing positions. Most significantly, examination of the grandmother's hands revealed a crucial difference. Her right hand, on the living boy, rested naturally on his shoulder. A grandmother's affectionate touch, light pressure, natural positioning. Her left hand, on the deceased boy, showed different positioning under enhancement. Fingers positioned more firmly, hand placement suggesting structural support as well as affection, helping to stabilize a figure that couldn't maintain balance independently. The technical evidence became overwhelming. The boy on the left, viewer's left, on the grandmother's right side, was deceased when this photograph was taken. Elizabeth Whitmore was sitting with one living grandson on her right and one dead grandson on her left, both boys dressed in matching suits, creating a final portrait showing both her twin grandsons together, even though one had already died. Victorian undertakers had prepared the deceased boy's body with remarkable skill, washing, arranging, positioning the eyes, styling the hair identically to his living twin, dressing him in the matching suit. The concealed posing stand held him upright in a natural-appearing standing position beside his grandmother's chair. The grandmother's hand provided additional stability while appearing to show grandmotherly affection. But the technical restoration, infrared imaging revealing tissue density differences, extreme magnification exposing corneal opacity, detection of the posing stand, analysis of the grandmother's hand positioning, made the truth undeniable. This was Victorian memorial photography, a grandmother with her twin grandsons, one living and one deceased, preserving one final image showing both boys together, documenting the family as it had been before death took one of the twins and left the elderly grandmother caring for the survivor alone. Research into Yorkshire death records from September 1896 revealed the medical and historical context, explaining the Whitmore family's tragedy and why this memorial photograph existed. Death certificate records showed Henry James Whitmore, age 5 years, 2 months, Date of death, September 12, 1896. Cause, diphtheria. Twin of Edward Charles Whitmore, surviving. Diphtheria was one of the most feared childhood diseases of the Victorian era. In 1896, before the development of effective antitoxins and vaccines, diphtheria killed thousands of British children annually, with mortality rates approaching 40 to 50% in severe cases. The disease is caused by Corynebacterium diphtheriae bacteria producing toxins that create characteristic symptoms. Formation of a thick membrane in the throat that can cause suffocation, severe sore throat, high fever, swollen neck glands, creating the distinctive bull neck appearance, and in severe cases, heart failure and death. In 1896, medical understanding of diphtheria was limited. The bacterial cause had been identified only recently, and effective treatment was in its infancy. The first diphtheria antitoxin had been developed just a few years earlier, in the early 1890s, but it wasn't widely available, especially in rural areas of Yorkshire. Treatment consisted primarily of attempting to remove the throat membrane manually, a dangerous procedure, isolation, bed rest, and supportive care. Mortality rates for diphtheria in 1896 were devastating. Children aged 2 to 10 were particularly vulnerable, with death rates of 35 to 50%, depending on the severity of infection and access to medical care. The disease could kill within 48 to 72 hours from onset of symptoms to death from suffocation or toxic shock. The year 1896 saw a particularly severe diphtheria outbreak across northern England. Yorkshire public health records documented hundreds of diphtheria deaths between July and October 1896, with the late summer and early autumn seeing peak mortality. Poor sanitation, overcrowded conditions, and limited medical resources contributed to rapid disease spread. For twins, diphtheria presented nightmare scenarios. The disease spread through respiratory droplets and direct contact, making exposure between twins living in the same household essentially inevitable. If one twin contracted diphtheria, the other twin faced near-certain exposure despite isolation attempts. Disease progression in diphtheria was rapid and unpredictable. The characteristic membrane could form within 24 hours of symptom onset, quickly blocking the airway. Children could appear to be recovering, then suddenly deteriorate and die from cardiac complications caused by bacterial toxins. The disease was particularly cruel in how it gave families brief hope before snatching it away. For wealthy families like the Whitmores, who could afford private physicians, the newest treatments, and the best nursing care, diphtheria was particularly devastating because wealth provided limited protection. Even with access to the newly developed antitoxin, which had to be shipped from London and might arrive too late, children still died. Money couldn't reliably save children from bacterial infections in an era before modern antibiotics. The Whitmore family's tragedy was compounded by earlier loss. Records show that the twins' mother, Elizabeth Whitmore's daughter, Margaret Whitmore Preston, had died in childbirth complications in 1891 when the twins were born. The boys' father, unable to care for infant twins while working, had sent them to be raised by their grandmother. Elizabeth Whitmore, already a widow, her husband had died in 1888, had taken in her orphaned infant grandsons and raised them for 5 years. When diphtheria struck in September 1896, Elizabeth was caring for both boys through their illness. Both twins fell sick simultaneously. Edward, the twin who would survive, developed a moderate case. His membrane formation was less severe, and his body fought off the toxins successfully. Henry developed a severe case. His membrane formation was extensive. His breathing became labored, and despite medical intervention, he died on September 12, 1896. The decision to create memorial photographs like the Whitmore portrait was rooted in several Victorian cultural factors. For twins specifically, memorial photography served crucial purposes, preserving the twin bond and giving the surviving twin a visual record of what had been lost. For Elizabeth Whitmore, the photograph served additional purposes. Having already lost her husband and her daughter, she was raising her orphaned grandsons alone in her late 60s. The photograph documented her family as it had been, showing both boys together with their grandmother who loved them, before diphtheria destroyed what little family remained. The Whitmore photograph, taken likely on September 13th or 14th, 1896, within 24 to 48 hours of Henry's death, represented Victorian attempts to preserve family wholeness, despite devastating loss. An elderly grandmother with both her twin grandsons, one living and one dead, creating one final image of 3 generations together, before death and grief left only 2 survivors of a family that had once been much larger. Genealogical research and preserved family documents revealed the complete story of the Whitmore family and the compounded losses that led to this photograph. Elizabeth Whitmore, née Ashford, was born in 1828 in Yorkshire to a prosperous merchant family. She married John Whitmore in 1848, and together they built a successful textile business in Yorkshire, becoming prominent members of the local merchant class. Elizabeth and John had 3 children, 2 sons who died in infancy in the 1850s, and a daughter, Margaret, born in 1865, the only child who survived to adulthood. Elizabeth had already experienced the grief of child loss twice before her daughter reached adulthood. Margaret Whitmore grew up in comfort and privilege. In 1889, at age 24, she married Thomas Preston, a solicitor from a respectable Yorkshire family. The match seemed fortunate. Thomas was educated, professionally successful, and from a good family. In 1888, tragedy struck when John Whitmore, Elizabeth's husband, died suddenly of a heart attack at age 62. Elizabeth, at age 60, became a widow. Victorian widowhood meant permanent mourning dress and altered social status, but Elizabeth's financial security, inherited from the textile business, meant she could maintain her household and independence. In 1891, Margaret became pregnant with twins, a pregnancy that brought joy to the family, especially to Elizabeth, who looked forward to becoming a grandmother. But Victorian childbirth remained dangerous despite medical advances. On July 15, 1891, Margaret Preston gave birth to twin boys, Henry James and Edward Charles, but died within hours from postpartum hemorrhage. She was 26 years old. Elizabeth, devastated by her daughter's death, took in the newborn twins. Thomas Preston, grief-stricken and overwhelmed, couldn't manage infant twins while maintaining his legal practice. Victorian gender roles meant men weren't expected to provide primary childcare. Thomas made financial arrangements to support the boys, but left them in Elizabeth's care, visiting occasionally but remaining emotionally distant from the children who reminded him of his dead wife. Elizabeth Whitmore, at age 63, began raising twin infant grandsons. Victorian society considered this unusual but admirable, an elderly widow taking on the burden of raising orphaned grandchildren. Elizabeth hired a nursemaid to assist, but she personally supervised the boys' upbringing, pouring into them the motherly love she couldn't give to her dead infant sons and her deceased daughter. The twins grew up calling Elizabeth Grandmama, but understanding she was the only mother figure they would ever know. Family letters preserved in archives describe the boys as inseparable, energetic, and bringing joy to Elizabeth's grief-shadowed household. A letter from Elizabeth's sister in 1894 describes the twins. Henry and Edward are delightful boys, so alike one can scarcely tell them apart. Elizabeth dotes on them. They have given her reason to live after losing dear Margaret. In early September 1896, both twins fell ill with symptoms of sore throat and fever. The family physician, Dr. William Harrison, diagnosed diphtheria on September 8th. Both boys were isolated in the nursery with round-the-clock nursing care. Edward's case remained moderate. His fever was high but manageable. His throat membrane formation was limited, and by September 11th, he was showing signs of improvement. Henry's case was severe from the onset. His throat membrane formed rapidly and extensively. Despite attempts to remove it and administration of the newly available antitoxin, rushed from London at considerable expense, Henry's breathing became increasingly labored. On September 12, 1896, at 3:20 a.m., Henry died of suffocation with his grandmother holding his hand. He was 5 years, 1 month, and 28 days old. Elizabeth Whitmore's diary entry for September 12, 1896, preserved in family archives, provides heartbreaking testimony. Henry departed this life at 20 minutes past 3 o'clock this morning. I was with him at the end, as I was with him at the beginning, when Margaret died, giving him life. Edward sleeps in the next room, still weak but recovering. How do I tell a 5-year-old child that his twin brother is gone, that half of him is dead? I have lost my sons in infancy, my husband, my daughter, and now one of my grandsons. Edward is all the family I have left in this world. The decision to have a memorial photograph taken with both twins was made by Elizabeth. A letter to her sister on September 13th explains, "I have engaged the photographer to come tomorrow. I wish to have one photograph showing me with both boys, Henry and Edward together as they always were. Edward deserves to have an image showing that he had a twin brother, that they were together, that our family was complete if only briefly. I am old and will not be here much longer. I want Edward to have something to remember all of us by." The photographer came on September 14th, 1896. The undertaker had prepared Henry's body to appear peaceful and natural, dressing him in a suit matching Edward's. Elizabeth sat in her formal mourning dress, which she would wear for the rest of her life, mourning husband, daughter, and grandson. Edward stood on one side, not fully comprehending that his twin brother would never wake. Henry's body, supported by the concealed posing stand and Elizabeth's hand, stood on the other side. For approximately 40 seconds while the photographer exposed the plate, Elizabeth Whitmore sat with both her grandsons, one living, one dead, creating one final image of 3 generations together. One final portrait showing both twins, one final photograph documenting what remained of a family that had been devastated by repeated losses. Edward Charles Whitmore lived until 1963, dying at age 72. He was raised by his grandmother until her death in 1904, when Edward was 13, then by distant relatives. Throughout his life, he kept the memorial photograph and reportedly told his own children about Henry, the twin brother he lost when both were 5 years old, and about the grandmother who raised him with love after his mother died and his twin was taken by disease. Elizabeth Whitmore lived until 1904, dying at age 76, having outlived her husband, her daughter, and one of her grandsons. She devoted her final years to raising Edward, ensuring he knew his family history and understood the love that had surrounded him despite all the losses. The memorial photograph remained the Whitmore family's most treasured possession for generations. One final image showing Elizabeth with both her twin grandsons, 3 generations captured together in a moment that was simultaneously about family unity and devastating loss. The Whitmore family photograph, once its true nature as memorial photography was revealed, became more than a family tragedy. It became a document of Victorian experiences of compounded loss, elderly caregiving, and the particular grief of raising grandchildren while mourning their deceased parent. Victorian memorial photography involving grandparents and grandchildren represented a poignant subset of an already emotionally complex photographic practice. Unlike photographs of parents with deceased children, which were common, photographs showing grandparents with deceased grandchildren highlighted generational loss and the particular pain of outliving not just one's children, but one's grandchildren as well. For Elizabeth Whitmore, the photograph documented multiple layers of loss. She had already buried 2 infant sons, her husband, and her only surviving daughter. Now she was burying one of her twin grandsons. The photograph showed her remaining family, herself and 2 grandsons, one of whom was dead. A visual inventory of what remained after death had taken so much. The practice of elderly grandparents raising orphaned grandchildren was relatively common in Victorian Britain, though it challenged age expectations. Victorian society generally assumed grandparents' roles were advisory and affectionate rather than primary caregiving. But death of adult children frequently left grandparents as the only available family caregivers for orphaned children, especially when the surviving parent, usually the father, couldn't or wouldn't provide direct childcare. Dr. Margaret Harrison, historian specializing in Victorian family structures, explains, Victorian grandparent-raised orphans faced unique challenges. The grandmother often felt she was raising her grandchildren as a duty to her deceased child, fulfilling the mothering her daughter couldn't provide. But the age gap created practical difficulties. A woman in her 60s or 70s raising active young children faced physical limitations, and the emotional burden was enormous. Grieving her child while raising her child's children, knowing she might not live to see them to adulthood. For twin memorial photography involving grandparents, additional complexities emerged. The surviving twin would be raised by an elderly grandmother who was mourning the deceased twin as well as the twin's deceased mother. The child would grow up understanding that multiple generations of his family had been lost before he could even remember them. Elizabeth Whitmore's letters, preserved in family archives, reveal the psychological complexity of her situation. In an 1897 letter to her sister, she wrote, "I look at Edward and see Henry's absence. They were so alike, so inseparable. Edward asks for Henry constantly, not understanding death. I must be strong for Edward, but I am old and tired and have buried too many people I loved. Sometimes I fear I will die before Edward is grown, and he will be orphaned twice, once by his mother's death and again by mine." Modern research on grandparent caregivers shows that elderly people raising orphaned grandchildren face unique stressors, physical demands of childcare at advanced ages, grief over adult child's death, combined with caregiving responsibilities, financial strain, social isolation, and anxiety about dying before grandchildren reach adulthood. The memorial photograph served crucial functions for Victorian grandparent-grandchild families. It documented the family structure, showing the grandmother as the children's primary caregiver and honoring her role. For surviving children like Edward, it provided visual evidence of their lost twin and their deceased grandmother's love and sacrifice. The ethical considerations around memorial photography involving elderly caregivers and deceased grandchildren add layers to existing debates. These photographs documented not just individual death, but generational loss, not just child mortality, but the burden placed on elderly women to continue mothering after their own children had died. Photography historian Dr. James Patterson argues, the Whitmore photograph is devastating on multiple levels. It shows a grandmother who has already buried her husband and daughter, now raising orphaned twins, one of whom has just died. She's in her late 60s, facing the prospect of raising the surviving twin alone for another decade or more. The photograph documents incredible resilience and love, but also the crushing burden Victorian society placed on elderly women to continue caregiving despite their own grief and physical limitations. For modern viewers, the photograph raises questions about intergenerational trauma, elder care, and the resilience required of people who lose multiple family members while maintaining responsibility for survivors. Elizabeth Whitmore lost 2 infant sons, her husband, her daughter, and a grandson. Yet she continued raising the surviving grandson for 8 more years until her death. The restoration that revealed the photograph's true nature, showing one living and one deceased twin with their grieving grandmother, adds another dimension. For 128 years, viewers saw simply a grandmother with twin grandsons. The restoration revealed the full story. A woman photographed with all that remained of her family, knowing she would soon be gone too, trying to preserve one final image of 3 generations together before death took the rest. When we look at this photograph now, at Elizabeth Whitmore seated with dignity in her mourning dress, her hands on both grandsons, one living and one dead, a woman who had buried a husband, a daughter, and half her grandchildren, we see something that forces us to reckon with Victorian experiences of repeated loss, with elderly women's caregiving burdens, with the resilience required to continue loving and nurturing despite devastating grief, and with the power of photography to preserve what death tries to destroy. The image of family, whole for just one final moment.